I play Captain Xavier, and this is Story Time with Captain Xavier. The story that you guys voted to hear this month was the time Captain Xavier single-handedly defeated an entire duchy all by himself. This happened, I think it was the year I turned 22. I had just accidentally become Duke of Alhambra, and I ended up going to Wisconsin for the summer to visit my father along with my brothers and sisters. I ended up working at the Kenosha Renaissance Fair that summer, which was so much fun and a wonderful learning experience. But I brought all of my medieval gear with me because, in addition to knowing that I was going to be working at that Ren Fair, so I needed a lot of that gear, I also knew that there was a local chapter of the Empire of Adria, the medieval group that I was in, and that I was Duke of. And so I thought maybe there was some chance that I'd be able to attend one of their events. So I brought all of my armor and most of my weapons and a load of other gear in the off chance that I got the opportunity to go visit them. Knew absolutely nothing about them. Our subdivision up in the Pacific Northwest had largely been isolated. We had very little contact at the Imperial level. We didn't really know anybody at the Imperial level. We didn't care about Imperial politics. We just wanted to, hang out and play our game, which was apparently very unusual for the larger empire, which was a very complex political organization, and there was all sorts of shenanigans and politics that we simply avoided as much as we possibly could. And back then we still could because we hadn't gotten involved at the Imperial level much. But I figured I'd connect up with the group while I was down there, and I did get the opportunity to. They were having a war. So I decided to show up at their war. And I'd made contact with the local, leader and said, hi, I'm visiting from wherever, and I was hoping I might be able to come to this war. And he's like, oh, sure, that'd be awesome. You should come down. It's at this place at this time. Like, okay, I will be there. But they didn't know who I was, or they hadn't made the connection. I hadn't been Duke for very long, and so apparently word hadn't spread, or my name just wasn't widely known, and so they didn't know that I was the Duke of Alhambra. They thought I was just some visiting schmuck, which is how I preferred it. I didn't want to be treated like a royal. I hadn't wanted to be a royal. It had been an accident, and the course of this trip I ended up technically losing my crown, as in I wasn't the crown anymore, and I had to fight to get it back, which culminated in the War of the Chains, which is one of my favorite wars that I ever fought in, which is definitely an amazing story. That will be one of the options. But I didn't tell them who I was or why I was there or anything like that. I just showed up, and they were looking at my gear that I had in my car, and well, there goes a spring. Somebody picked up my steel helmet, my heavy helmet, and in it was my actual crown, which I should get out for visual purposes because it's a thing to see. This is my royal bling box. There's a great deal of royal bling in here. But my crown, which was made for me by Sir Crispin, the crazy blacksmith, and as you can see, it's made out of knives. They're not particularly sharp, but I had it in the helmet, and this guy picked up the helmet and turned it over so that he could look at it, and the crown came down and stabbed him in the hand. Didn't, go deep, but it did break the skin. And he's like, what's this? And he pulls it out, and they're like, what's going on here? Like, well, that's my crown. Why do you have a crown? Well, I might be the Duke of Alhambra. Next thing you know, I'm sitting in the shade with a lemonade and a beautiful woman fanning me, which is why I didn't want to tell them, because I'm not, big into that sort of pomp and circumstance. But it occurred to me that since I was the crown of another subdivision, it was entirely within my authority to declare war on another subdivision. So I did. I declared war on them. Me, all by myself, in this foreign land, thousands of miles from home. I declared war on an entire subdivision. And I won. And the reason I won was because of a very large difference in cultures. We in the Pacific Northwest in Alhambra were a violent warmongering people, largely because of me and my sergeant. But we really liked having wars and contested wars, and since I have always been a very competitive person, I always wanted to win said wars, and so I kicked off an arms race that lasted for 5 years of us constantly improving our weapons, siege engines, arrows, throwing axes, everything we could think of. If we could find a loophole in the rules to allow us to use them, or in some cases there just wasn't a rule against them, so we did it, we did. And I brought all of that with me, and the subdivision that I was in, Andorra, had never had a contested war. Their subdivision was as old as ours was, but they had never had a contested war because they'd never needed one. Usually you have a contested war when it's two people who both want to be the crown, go to war against each other, and whoever wins the war gets to be crowned. But if nobody ever if you only ever have one person try to run, then you never end up with a contested war. You have what we just refer to as fun wars, where you just divide the sides up evenly and you fight, and then you switch the sides up and you fight some more, and it's just everybody has fun. But that kind of a war doesn't tend to lead to arms races because you're never worried about winning. You're just worried about having fun, and in which case, you don't need to deal with, missile weapons and siege engines and shield tactics and all of that. You can just go out there and flail at each other with swords. And so they had never had any kind of an arms race. They had never developed anything past swords. They only had one person who was starting to dabble in pole arms, and they had a couple of people with shields, but they had nothing on the military complex that we had in the Northwest, and I brought all of that with me. So I ended up squaring off against an army of, I don't remember how many it was, 6 or 7 people, I think. They didn't have a lot of fighters. And they all had swords. Just a sword. And I had a long sword on my side, a short sword on my back, a dozen arrows in a quiver over my shoulder, half a dozen javelins in a javelin quiver, a throwing axe, a small buckler strapped to my arm, and a bow. And so I had more firepower than the entire subdivision. They had no missile weapons of any kind. And so I tore them apart. I took out several with arrows before they could even get close to me, took out one with a javelin, took out one with a throwing axe, pulled out the swords, and just went to town. And then after that one battle of me versus everybody and me just completely destroying them and them just kind of going, this is what war is like. I let them play with all my toys. Like, here, you get arrows, you get javelins, you get throwing axes, here's some extra shields, let's do this. And it was an absolute blast. And then I got sat down in the shade and told about their culture. And it was absolutely fascinating because it was so completely different than ours. Where we had gone full bore into war, we had done, all of this arms race and all of this weapons development and training and all of that. And I mean, we had mobile castles and so forth designed for siege and siege engines and all of that kind of stuff. They had gone the other route into public education type stuff. So their public display setup, where they would set up a full, proper medieval camp with everything that a medieval camp would, basically a small village. They had handmade their own full canvas pavilions, all in matching colors for their subdivision, and they had, arts entries and chairs that they'd made and tables and everything you could imagine that you would have in a medieval village. They would take out and set up at these Ren fairs as a demonstration, and people would come in and they'd learn and they'd get to tinker with stuff and they would do all of that, and we had none of that. We barely had period encampments. We had a couple of people that had bought period tents, but most of us are still in dome tents or, whatever we had, because we weren't doing the public stuff. We did one Ren fair a year, we did Greenwood, and we didn't have a period encampment. We just had it all behind a wall that we set up. And then we did, the public demonstrations on their stages, whereas these people had their own encampment and their own stage and did their own sword fighting demonstrations and all of that. And just absolutely amazing. They were also elbow deep in the Imperial Politics. Their leader was very, very active in Imperial Politics, which at that point we were not at all. We didn't get active until after I stepped down, and the next people, the people who came after me, were the ones who finally got us noticed. Well, apparently I'm the one who got us noticed on the Imperial stage, but they were the ones that had to deal with the fallout of me making us visible on Imperial level. Apparently, when you go to war with another subdivision and crucify their leader, and it gets published in the Imperial newsletter, people notice. That's another fun story. So, yeah, that's how I ended up taking on their entire soldier. I later came back down for a tournament, and again, beat them all because they were just on a very different level combat-wise than we were. Their technique was very, very good, but they didn't have the level of experience or the depth of styles, so they were all still fighting single sword, and I showed up with a polearm, and it didn't go well for them. But we then got to have fun and, you know, train afterwards and show them techniques, and it was just a wonderful experience. They were a great organization. But they were defeated, and it was fun, and, you know, and that we didn't end up, you know, declaring them a vassal or anything. It was just me showing up and having fun. But when I came back, I discovered that my throne had been usurped by my chancellor, and that meant war. And that war was the War of the Chains. So that will be one of the optional stories. The whole backstory of the War of the Chains and the actual war itself. The border war, the second border war. The second border war was the one that led to the crucifixion of Lord Dorne. Or the runner-up from last time was the time that a deaf boy taught the Empire of Adria the meaning of chivalry. So those are your three options. I hope you enjoyed this story. I hope I remembered it correctly. It's been 13 years. I'm probably embellishing it. And there's probably at least one member from that subdivision who's like, that's not how it happened. Well, that's how I remember it. And I'm telling the story, so ha! Anyway, those will be your choices. Survey will be down below. I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you guys for watching.